Hi guys. So today's video is going to be 10 tips to get into adult science fiction and fantasy books. There are a lot of things that make science fiction and fantasy seem really daunting, one being the fact that a lot of the books are massive, or the series themselves are massive and they're 10 plus books long, and you're talking about characters living in places that we don't live in. They're make-believe worlds, and often that can be really difficult to latch onto and to feel connection with. But adult science fiction fantasy is one of the best genres. It has some amazing stories, and I absolutely think it's worth giving a try. Hopefully then, these 10 tips will help you feel a little bit better about going into these books, and the first tip I would have is do not start with the heavy hitters, the most popular books, the ones that are always on the tops of the best fantasy science fiction books of all time lists. I completely understand why somebody would want to maybe go down this route. They think, I want to get into this, so what's the best? What is the thing that represents this genre better than any other book? And they pick up Wheel of Time, and it's 14 books long. Each of the books is pretty long, and there's so many characters, and there's so much to the series, and then they feel so overwhelmed by it that they give up. It's a silly analogy, but if I want to get into hiking, I am not going to go hike Mount Everest first. I'm going to start small with something approachable and something manageable, and I think that that is the same and can definitely be applied to science fiction and fantasy books also. This leads right into tip number 2, which is to find shorter stories. A lot of adult science fiction fantasy books not only are long page count wise, but they're really long series. And the ones that are a little bit shorter, that are standalones or duologies or trilogies, or just literally have less pages, are usually going to be easier to get into. This is of course not going to be true of every single book. The Dresden Files series, while the books themselves aren't very long, this series is really long, and I think it's super approachable and very easy to get into. Whereas there are some books like The Kingkiller Chronicles, which are only currently 2 books out. It's supposed to be a trilogy, but while the writing is beautiful, I would say it's not the best book to pick up if you're not used to fantasy. For the most part though, I do think that even if a book ends up being kind of dense, it still makes you feel a little bit better to know there's only 1 or 2 or maybe 3 than knowing that there are 14. Tip number 3 is try to look into authors that write both in the young adult section and the adult section. Some examples of authors who do this would be V.E. Schwab, Brandon Sanderson, J. Kristoff. Those are just a few, but often these authors, because they write in multiple different age ranges, they're going to be able to tap into something that it feels like any age can appreciate. And if you want to combine this with tip number 2, Sanderson happens to have some standalones and a trilogy that you can check out. V.E. Schwab has a trilogy, and she's currently writing another trilogy, so these are authors that write in both sections and have some shorter series or shorter books. Tip number 4 would be try to identify what kinds of things you enjoy in books. If you really appreciate humor, then it doesn't probably matter if the series or the books are really long. If that's a big key element of a book that you're going to like, then check out books, even if they're really massive, that are probably going to appeal to you because you know you enjoy that. If you're somebody that really likes easygoing pacing and you like to have things unfold gradually, and you also love great world building, then these Stormlight Archive books, which are each over 1,000 pages, aren't probably going to feel that off-putting to you because you know that you like those particular things, and that's something that the Stormlight Archive series is known for. A somewhat similar tip, but slightly different, is tip number 5, start with something that is familiar. If you don't read any fantasy at all, and you're maybe coming from a genre like contemporaries, and then you're trying to get into science fiction fantasy, there are going to be certain sub-genres of the science fiction fantasy that are going to appeal to you more. There's an author that I personally haven't read yet, but I know he is known for writing historical fantasy. His name is Guy Gabriel Kay, and this is the perfect author for somebody who really enjoys historical fiction. A lot of Guy Gabriel Kay's books are essentially our own world in a certain time period or a certain place or both, but he just kind of changes the names. That's a very simplistic way to put it, but it's very heavily influenced by certain points and certain places in history. So if you're really into history, you're probably going to really like Guy Gabriel Kay's works. Tip number 6 is one that I'm kind of shoving sort of in the middle of all these because it's a little bit taboo to say as a book nerd, but if there's an adaptation, check it out. Books are amazing, but at the end of the day, sometimes it's easier to just sit down and watch a movie and kind of decide if it seems like something you'd be into than it is to check out books and spend hours upon hours trying to get into a world. I'm not saying that you shouldn't read the books at all. I'm just saying this is a good way to get yourself introduced to a story that you might potentially like. I am a huge fan of the Witcher series, but I was introduced to the Witcher series through the video game by CD Projekt Red called The Wild Hunt. It's the third Witcher game. It's my favorite video game of all time, and oh my gosh, I think that having gone from that to reading the books allowed me to like the books even more and to feel really immersed in them even more because I had the characters' voices in my head. I kind of had an idea of what they looked like. I am going to put in a slight disclaimer to this, which is that even if you don't enjoy the movie or whatever form of an adaptation that you're looking into, doesn't mean that you might not like the books more. There's a reason a lot of times people say the books are better, so if you check something out and you're not the biggest fan of it, it's possible that the books are done better. This is just purely a tip to get you interested in something in a timely manner. Tip number 7 would be to find completed works. A very commendable trait of young adult science fiction fantasy writers is that they get things out in a timely manner. Now, there is a reason for that. They're writing usually shorter books, and the plot is more concise. You're dealing with less characters and a smaller world. But you're gonna find that with the adult fantasy section and adult sci-fi section, sometimes it can take 8 or more years to get a next installment. If you really want an accurate representation of whether or not you enjoy this genre, you're gonna probably want to find a story that you can finish, you can mull over, you can think about, and then maybe go into something else rather than having to wait years and years and years. Tip number 8 would be to check out books that are more modern and less classic. Classic sci-fi and fantasy is of course not lesser than modern sci-fi fantasy. It's just that it was a different time period. So the writing was different and the writing norms were different and what people looked for in storytelling was different. And nowadays you're gonna feel a little bit like you're more accustomed to more than likely the modern sci-fi fantasy writers. While the trilogy Lord of the Rings might seem like the perfect series to start with because it's a trilogy, the books aren't that long, there's an adaptation, it just seems like it's the best shot for seeing if you like the fantasy genre. It's classic fantasy, and anybody who has read Lord of the Rings will tell you you probably don't want to start with it. Tip number 9 would be to check out suggestion videos geared specifically for people who are newbies to the science fiction fantasy section. These videos, generally speaking, are made by people who read a lot of books and often read both adult science fiction fantasy and young adult science fiction fantasy, and so they kind of know what people are going to be looking for when they're transitioning. This is just a great way to maybe have your eyes open to some books that you've not heard of or maybe you're not familiar with, like some of the books that often pop up on those best of lists. And tip number 10, very similar to check out adaptations, would be to look into listening to some audiobooks. Audiobooks aren't for everyone, so of course this isn't going to be a great tip for everybody, but often audiobooks are going to tap into something that you just don't get when you're reading it and the words are in your head, which is going to be the cadence and the way in which we imagine the different characters. Voice actors can really make the book come to life in a way that we might not just reading it in our brains. That's it for my 10 tips to get into adult science fiction and fantasy. Please let me know what some of your tips are, and if you have any specific books that you think are great for transitioning into this genre, please leave them in the comment section down below. As always, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to check out the Patreon and also check out the charity Save the Children. I always have a link to it in the description bar down below, but anyway, I'll see you all later. Bye.